Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's special webinar. My name is Maggie Howell, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Wolf Conservation Center. Before we get started and get to the fun stuff, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in the control panel. It should be at the bottom of your screen. If you type questions into the chat, we will not be able to see those. So please, the Q&A box is where you want to put those cues. And we will provide some time at the end of tonight's presentation. Also, there will be a recorded version of this webinar available on the Wolf Conservation Center website within a day or two. All right, so let's get to the good stuff. I hope you're all as excited as I am about this evening's presentation. We're joined this evening by Dr. Rolf Peterson, who has generously offered his time to discuss wolf restoration in Isle Royale National Park. Dr. Rolf Peterson is an internationally recognized wildlife ecologist at Michigan Tech University, and he began leading the Isle Royale wolf moose study in the early 1970s and has continued his primary role in the project for over 4 decades of the study's 60-year history. In 2006, Dr. Peterson retired from a faculty position at Michigan Technological University to devote even more time to the Wolf Moose Project, and now spends more time on Isle Royale than he does on the mainland. In addition to wolf research at Isle Royale, he and his students have conducted wolf studies in Alaska, Yellowstone, Minnesota, and mainland Michigan. In 2017, Dr. Peterson was even among Discover magazine's favorite scientists of all time. Woohoo! So now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rolf Peterson, and he's one of our favorite scientists too. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Maggie. I guess whenever I need a publicist, I'll give you a call.
I'm here.
So I'll talk generally about wolf restoration at Isle Royale tonight and cover most of the stuff is brand new. So even if you've heard me before, most of this you will not have seen before. I would like to acknowledge for funding and institutional support, National Science Foundation and Michigan Tech and the National Park Service. Without them, it wouldn't have happened. And also acknowledge John Justich and Sarah Hoy, who, as the academics, the primary academics, they're doing most of the heavy lifting. So I do the fun stuff. So for more than 60 years, the number of wolves and moose has been estimated in winter at Isle Royale. And that's what you see here. I won't explain most of all those fluctuations, but the key thing to see is that that red line, ever since 2005, has been in a slide, a long decline, pretty sudden actually. And to the point where by 2016, there were just 2 wolves left on Isle Royale. And those 2 hung on for some years. But in 2018, a major operation by the National Park Service, an intervention, was undertaken to reverse that wolf decline. So I'll be reporting on some of that. And the monitoring of those wolves once they hit the island was largely responsibility of the National Park Service, and then also researchers from State University of New York. If we back up just a couple of years, this is the whole wolf population on Isle Royale. Two wolves left. The male in the back, we call him male 183, and the female in the front 193. Father and daughter, brother and sister, husband and wife. Yeah, it's a mess. They did reproduce 1 year in 2014, and they produced a misshapen, sickly-looking thing, which that was it. After that, the female steadfastly refused to mate with her father. Ultimately, the problem for wolves on Isle Royale became one of isolation, excessive isolation, caused by lack of ice connecting Isle Royale with the mainland. 100 years ago, the ice was absolutely something you could count on. It was a winter road, essentially. The U.S. mail came across with horses and dog teams. But by beginning in the 1920s, actually, temperature in this part of the world started going up. And by 1959, of course, our observational record began, in which we'd record every year whether there's ice or not. In 1973, some satellites were launched, which started to do that. And our observational record matches the satellite record. And they both show a decline in the frequency of ice bridges, pretty steady from the 60s to the present. We still do have occasional ice bridges, but it's not sufficient to keep wolves, the wolf population innervated with new genes. And that's ultimately the problem, excessive genetic inbreeding from isolation. And of course, the ice bridge decline matches the major climate change signal in this part of the world is increased temperature in the winter, shorter winters, and also windier conditions on Lake Superior, all tied to global increase in CO2. The climate change that's affected the wolves on Isle Royale, I would almost consider a quiet crisis compared to everything else going on in the world's climate. If you just, I mean, the news this week covered the hurricane, which you see here, depicted just before it hit Central America. The fires this fall produced that image up on the upper right, which is, it's unbelievable that that's even the planet Earth, actually. So by comparison, the Isle Royale climate change problem seems very minor, but if you're a wolf, it became a major issue. Fortunately, it's an issue that could be fixed. And so after watching patiently for a while, the Park Service engaged in an environmental impact study beginning in 1915 to determine what they should do, if anything, about the decline in wolves. 2015, and that continued until it was signed off in 2018 with a recommendation to intervene and repopulate the island with a wolf population. And of course, the ultimate reason for that was to preserve the integrity of the forest ecosystem. And over the period of just 13 months, the Park Service moved very, very quickly. I mean, I have to give them credit for responding relatively instantly to the directive. So with the help of numerous agencies, state agencies, the province of Ontario, the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, the governor of Michigan, the premier of Ontario, federal agencies, state agencies. I mean, everybody wanted this to succeed. So wolves were brought from 4 different populations. One was another island population, Michipicoten Island. And then the other 3 areas were mainland. The Michipicoten group of wolves, that's a whole nother story, but the wolves founded a population on that island coming over the ice in around 2014, I think. And they reproduced several years in a row. And that had been an isolated caribou population, which the wolves found to be ideal prey, and isolated on a tiny little island. From a caribou standpoint, the wolves just ate their way through that caribou population to the point where the wolves were starving. So by 2019, it became an opportunity to you know, it sounds easy, but just move wolves from Michipicoten to Isle Royale. And actually, that's what happened. The wolves were in very poor shape. So they didn't even meet the health standards that the Park Service had set, but turns out they did fine. They recovered just fine. And now they dominate the population on Isle Royale. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So I'll talk about some of the soap opera that's been going on with the new wolves, and also I'd like to close with some general discussion about the indirect effects of wolves, because it's a pretty vital issue. Many of you have seen how wolves, the video, how wolves change rivers, and some of that's true, and but that's kind of gotten stuck in the public mind with the notion that simply putting top carnivores back on the landscape fixes everything. So this headline, "Can Rewilding Large Predators Regenerate Ecosystems?" comes from an article just early in the month that reviews attempts to restore jaguars in Argentina, and of course the Yellowstone example is the primary one. So I'll talk about that a bit too. But we'll back up just over a year. The last remaining wolves on Isle Royale were just 2, of course, and they weren't radio collared or anything. So we never figured we'd ever hear about what happened to them unless we were very lucky. But we were very lucky. A ranger, Mike Osama here on the left, was doing his last hike around the island pretty much by himself, the only person out there, and he ran into this newly dead wolf. And so he immediately went over there and bagged him up. And that was the male, the last of one of the last 2 wolves on the island, male 183. And it looked like he just laid down and died, but actually after he was necropsied in a federal lab in Madison, it turns out he had some injuries from a wolf attack. So he hadn't been killed right there, but he received some wounds that proved to be fatal. And he was underweight and very old, and he's probably the equivalent of about a 80, 90-year-old human male. So I think the new wolves realized, okay, this guy can probably be taken finally. But his legacy lives on, as I'll point out. This is a picture of Ranger Matt Zavalette, who helped carry him out. But the reason I put this in there was actually because of the trees, those young aspen trees in the background. Germany sprouted in the early 2000s, primarily as a result of a trophic cascade caused by very intensive wolf predation on moose in the first decade of the 21st century, which produced the lowest moose population we'd ever seen. And that led to a major release of trees, especially aspen, in many parts of the island. So this wolf did have a part in that. Let's see. He was mortally wounded by other wolves, and I put up a couple of cameras at the spot where his carcass ended up, just to see who might show up. Let's see. And within a week, one of the new wolves, a black male from mainland Ontario, came by. He was so skittish of our scent, of course, that he didn't even use the trail. He just viewed from afar the scene and then took off. And he came back again about 2 weeks after the wolf had been killed. This time he ventured onto the trail itself and inspected where that wolf had been. I suppose you might wonder whatever happened to that guy. Did he get up and leave? And then he showed up again. Oh, well, about a minute later, another black wolf came by. And this wolf was captured in the same general area, as the other wolf. It may be their father and daughter. Let's see, we'll back up one more here. Just hold on there a minute, because we won't see her again. She died 1, 2, 3 months later, not too far away from this spot, and probably was killed, but was killed by other wolves. There wasn't much left of her. It wasn't possible to be sure what happened exactly. let's see, the wolves all have numbers. They all have fancy jewelry on them, a GPS radio collar, ear tags in both ears. And those are important methods to monitor what happened to these wolves. And they produced some, with proximity sensors. They also told researchers and Park Service monitoring personnel how close they were to other wolves in the population. And from that information, we can be pretty sure that every wolf in the population has seen every other wolf in the population. They all know each other. If not face to face, they've been within 100 yards of each other. So they've had a chance to check each other out and self-organize. I mean, that was the expectation, and the wolves had no trouble figuring that out. Of course, some wolves didn't survive the reorganization. Probably 5 wolves were killed by other wolves. And, they don't have elections. It's a bit of a power struggle, but wolves are by nature relatively reluctant to fight, particularly if they're not in a territorial group. But I will introduce a couple of these wolves, number 11F, female 11 and male 16, just because they're an interesting pair. And male 16 is the only black wolf left. So he's distinctive in his own right. Female 11 is from Michipicoten Island, and she didn't really have a territory to live in. She knew how to stay safe, however, by swimming to offshore islands. And the amount that these wolves swam to outer islands was really quite surprising. About late January, she went down to the middle of the island, picked up male 16, and introduced him to swimming in the middle of the winter. I'm not sure he was really wild about it, but they did, in fact, swim back and forth, sometimes with white caps, way below freezing temperatures. And they freely moved back and forth all year round between outer islands and the main island. And that was pretty important as a survival mechanism, because those outer islands are relatively little visited by the main territorial packs. And we'll revisit these wolves later here. So at 11 and 16, you can see the green tracing of their movements in those outer islands way off to the left. And otherwise, they went back and forth on the North Shore, generally staying out of the range of the wolves, leaving that yellow tracing, number 1 and 7, who were the territorial wolves at the west end. But 11 and 16 were chased by both of the main territorial groups, but either they escaped them or they somehow outfoxed them or faced them off. I don't know. But I think if they were terribly vulnerable, they would have already been killed by now. The legacy of the last native wolves lives on in the territorial arrangement in the upper map, where the island is split into 2. The red lines representing 12 and 15, those exactly correspond to the territory that the last native pair claimed, because they were still in place as 1 and 7 and a third wolf got going early on. So the only place 1 and 7 and 13 could go is the west half of the island. But as soon as the native male died, wolves began to infiltrate that east end, and within just a few weeks, 12 and 15 sort of emerged as the territory holders. But a lot of I'd say most of the wolves traveled through that area, and then 12 and 15 ended up defending it as a territory. 14, down in the lower right, if there's one other wolf, remembering the number for it would be 14, female 14, because she's the mother of all those Michipicoten wolves. And being their mother doesn't mean that she has their respect, and it doesn't necessarily mean she's safe, but she may have a bit of a free pass through some of these areas. We don't really know. but she spent most of her time between these two named areas, Conglomerate Bay and Houghton Ridge. And she will emerge later in this story in a very surprising way. Well, then those two uncollared wolves, those are the surprise. I'll get to. Back to 11 and 16, very nice looking pair. And they were, of all the wolves, the ones of the collared newcomers, the ones we saw the most. And they eventually showed typical courtship behavior. They didn't sleep right close to each other as a long-term mated pair might, who might just plop down one on the other. But they were definitely interested in each other, and it's very likely they mated. But as far as we know, they didn't have pups. But this is the same pair now. This is 11. And 16 will show up shortly. This is that same remote camera at the site where that original male died. This is last spring though, so 7-8 months later, these two wolves are going back to that site again, which makes me wonder if the male 16 wasn't involved in the fatal attack on that native male. So they're inspecting that site once again. There was a large scat left there when the male died, and hopefully we'll get a genetic read on who might have been there at the site. Now, this was in May when pups should have been born, and I don't see any nipples or obvious indicator that female 11 had pups, but I'll reserve judgment till later. I don't think she did. But they are in the middle of the island, and they're obviously surviving, and there is room probably, we think, for a third territorial pack, and maybe they will figure all that out and muscle their way into the existing social pattern. This is, I think, one of the biggest stories that will eventually emerge is the variation in size amongst all these wolves. The Isle Royale population, represented by the last male on the right, was really pretty small-bodied wolves. I mean, 70 to 95 pounds, and quite small compared to some of these newcomers. The male on the right here had a shorter skull than a female that came from the Michigan mainland, but he had a slightly wider skull. But both of them really are dwarfs compared to the Michipicoten wolves. They are really truly large, and that one depicted here has a full inch longer skull than the average male from northern Alberta, which are regarded as the largest wolves in North America. So I think the Michipicoten wolves are comparable in size, probably to the Yellowstone wolves, which is a huge change from the original population. Now, we don't know if they're large because the stock they came from, Northern Ontario, is all large. That could be, but they also came from parents that were exceptionally well nourished in the early days of feeding on caribou in Michipicoten Island. So, but monitoring the changes in wolf size will be very interesting over time. The surprise, February, third week of February, we ran into these two wolves, not at all afraid of the airplane, not radio collared, not ear tagged. We had absolutely no idea who they were. And we spent a lot of time taking pictures of them and blowing the pictures up and looking every which way. Absolutely no hint that they'd ever had a radio collar or ever had air tags. And in the end, we concluded, with also some help from outside experts, Rick McIntyre at Yellowstone, Kira Cassidy at Yellowstone, also Laurie Schmidt at the International Wolf Center, who probably are the three reigning experts in interpreting wolf behavior. The one on top, probably a pup, and it's worth going back and realizing that female 14 probably came in pregnant. And later on, remote cameras showed that there were in fact 2 pups present the previous summer. So one of these pups survived. And of course, 14's at the other end of the island, which, made no sense at this time. And then who this other wolf is a complete mystery, even now. We don't know who it is. We don't know if it's a male for sure. I suspect it's a male, but it's not for sure. The same 3 wolves a little bit later on, the pup coming in from the lower left. And then female 14 is bedded there, and she's had a pretty hard life, but she's still there and amazingly reproduced in 2019. The same 3 wolves. You can see female 14 in the lower left there. Her coat isn't as nice and sleek as the other wolves. And it's that the wolf we believe to be a pup that's right by her side. And then the other big wolf, bigger than the pup, is trailing the pair. This is, when I showed this photo to Laurie Schmidt at the Wolf Center, who's, by the way, written an ethogram for wolves in which she's described virtually every behavioral expression of wolves. She looked at it and said, oh, well, of course that's a pup because it's showing I got to get this right, a pricked ear face-off. I said, well, what's that? And so she sent me a picture of 2 wolves from the Wolf Center, where a pup on the right here is attempting to face off with this alpha male who's not really interested in participating much. But this is a very characteristic behavior of pups. So yeah, she said right away, that's what's going on there. So it's a nice convergence of information from captivity informing what we see in wild wolf behavior, which we often just get little snippets of here and there. And then, of course, it was very interesting to everyone what might happen this past summer. Would there be reproduction? How much reproduction? And rather inconveniently, most of the radio collars on those wolves failed just before the summer season. So the wolves at the west end still continued to transmit and indicated, yeah, there was a litter of pups at the west end, but the east end wolves collars all failed. So in September, though, we were quite surprised when we pulled our canoe ashore at this beach at the east end, and there's these tracks all over the place. And in the end, I decided that they had to be wolf pup tracks, maybe 2 or 3, not a huge mob, but right in the area where you might expect female 14 to show up. Excuse me. So that was interesting, but it couldn't be concluded that they were distinct from the pups that we already knew had been produced by the territorial group at the east end. So, but a tantalizing possibility of another small litter of pups. And then in later on September, we were over on the north side at the east end and ran into just a minefield of wolf tracks, a drained beaver pond where wolves had gotten in and eaten the beavers after their dam had broken. And there was about a half acre just absolutely covered with wolf tracks. So probably a large litter of pups who had been there quite a while. Here's a nice bed that's been carved out by one of the adults, presumably. So they camped out here for quite some time. They didn't get every beaver because a couple of weeks later, a little bit of a dam was rebuilt and beavers once again started to flood the sites. But evidence certainly of a second good-sized litter of pups. So we would expect 2 litters for sure, and maybe 3. We'll have to wait and see. The topic of trophic cascades looms pretty importantly these days in areas where wolves have been recently established. For example, Yellowstone, where much of the trophic cascade work's been done, primarily with what's happened to aspen trees and willows after wolves were introduced. And it's a pretty long and complicated story, and I won't spend a lot of time there. But I'd say the jury is still out in trying to describe exactly what the effect of wolves at Yellowstone has been on the forest. Clearly, there are tree-size aspen coming up, and areas where willow have done better than they were doing 30 years ago. But it's not just the wolf. During the 90s, grizzly bears were increasing right along, and cougars also recovered themselves. So all 3 of the original top carnivores, wolves, bears, grizzly bears, and cougars, all increased in the 90s and all started killing elk. And they're all part of the generalized elk decline, as human hunters are also. So there's no question elk are reduced compared to 25 years ago. And that has had some dramatic effects on aspen and willow. But it's all terrestrial stuff. So with an animal like moose that spends a lot of time underwater, you wonder if any of this trophic cascade phenomenon might be seen in aquatic areas. Let's see, the moose does spend a lot of time in the water, and we sometimes call them the boreal hippo. They individual moose may get 1/3 of their annual nutrient intake from aquatic plants. Aquatic plants are real high in protein. This bull is radio collared, as are some 40 moose on Isle Royale now, with very fancy collars that tell us where the moose is every 30 minutes and tell us how active they are with accelerometers every 5 minutes. So we'll know a lot of information about these individuals. There's also a temperature sensor on the back of this radio collar right here that will help us determine if the moose is actually in the water in addition to its locations. So moose have spent a lot of time in the water, but you can't see what they're doing down there. So that's been a long-term interest of a lot of people. And we did have an opportunity 16 years ago now to see what moose actually do underwater. It's a very unique setup. We were very fortunate that we got this footage, but it's basically an underwater little yellow submarine. And we were in a place where the water where the current pushes out the sediment, so you can actually see what the moose is doing. This is the only existing footage of a moose underwater, and nobody's been able to duplicate it yet. So hopefully somebody does someday. But a couple of things noteworthy: the moose has got its eyes open all the time, but it's not very selective. It seems to just eat everything. It brings its head up occasionally, of course, to get air, but also to check for danger. There's nothing dangerous under the water that a moose fears. So this little yellow submarine in front of its face was not a problem. And also you don't see bubbles being blown because moose have a very interesting and unique nose anatomy. That's what that long nose is about. Muscles and ligaments that allow them to close off their nostrils. You and I can't do that. So moose just has to think about it, and it can consciously close off its nose, which is another unique aquatic adaptation. So I'd like to just take you through a interesting case history, which began about 14 years ago. This is Lake Ojibwe, one of the 4 dozen named lakes on Isle Royale. It's actually a large beaver pond. It was initially impounded by beavers in the 1950s. And in 2006, we noticed this green plant becoming prevalent over the entire shallow water surface of the lake, and also a half dozen other small ponds and lakes on Isle Royale. And that's this green floating leaf, sort of a lily pad type thing. It's a native aquatic plant called water shield. And I'd never seen it before. I didn't even know what the plant was. Finally managed to figure that out with some help from experts, but none of the experts could tell me why all of a sudden it shows up everywhere. And this is Lake Ojibwe surface virtually covered by this plant, which is highly nutritious, very high protein content, and it's perfect food for beavers and moose. And they soon started eating it. And this Lake Ojibwe had 3 very large beaver colonies, a very vibrant local beaver population. So, but it suddenly became covered with this green plant. And so we started watching Lake Ojibwe pretty closely every year, and eventually started measuring it with photos to see how much of the lake surface was covered by this plant. And while we were measuring, moose, of course, discovered the lake and began feeding in great numbers. But moose had been relatively rare during the middle 2000s, and that's probably why this plant got going. It was essentially freed from herbivory, by moose at least. So while predation was very high in the early 2000s, moose were kept in check, and we continued to see water shield dominate this lake. But then about 2012, the wolf population suddenly collapses, and moose began a sustained increase. And by now, they're telling all their relatives, they come to Lake Ojibwe and eat aquatic plants. And they came in droves. So we saw as many as 15 moose at one time in Lake Ojibwe feeding on water shield, as many as 30 individuals in a day. There was a graduate student, Brenda Bergman, who put up an exposure in Lake Ojibwe and several other places to see what the extent of aquatic herbivory was. And she very cleverly fenced off the inside of the exclosure so that moose and beaver were both excluded from half the exclosure, but beaver were allowed into 1/2. So one shows the effect of, but in the end, she was able to determine the effect of both moose and beaver herbivory. She found that moose in Lake Ojibwe ate 10 times more aquatic plants than beaver did. So they have the potential to outcompete beaver. And that's exactly what happened. Moose just took over this lake and actually would deplete the entire supply of aquatic plants by the end of the summer, as well as tearing up the shoreline. And it kind of looked a bit like an open sewer in places. Oops. And then finally in 2017, the main beaver dam that holds back the whole lake broke, and the lake drained, at least all the shallow part of the lake drained. Well, now, nobody knows what is going to happen next. And turns out within a couple of weeks, wolves showed up and took out the local beaver population. So this is the one remaining male, and we're going to look at a few seconds of him, but you can see his stomach is as full as it can possibly be, and he's actually carrying a baby beaver, a kit beaver, in his mouth because he can't fit it into his stomach. So he's dining very high on the hog here, as well as scent marking. And then, a minute later, the female comes by, equally full. So this is what happened to many of the beavers. And then that's what the lake looked like after the lake drained, exposing vast mud flats that hadn't seen air for half a century. Well, now all bets are off. You don't know what in the world's going to happen. But there's no food for beavers, no reason for them to recolonize. They've eaten all the trees within easy range of the shore. So they just either died or moved out. And then, somewhat unpredictably, moose found it to be a death trap. In the last 3 summers, 7 moose have gotten mired in this mud and died right there. So this is all leading who knows where. But it's a story of the death of a lake, really, as well as quite a few moose and beavers. And the whole story involves wolves and moose and beaver and what they all do out there in nature. But it does call to mind this quote by Tom Hobbs at Colorado State. Predators are so important, their removal has such long-lasting effects that it's naive to think that you can quickly reverse the effects of their absence by restoration. It's relatively easy to measure the success of the wolf translocation. It's a huge success. The wolves are doing fine, and they're doing exactly what it was hoped that they would do. But the long-term effects of just a few years of wolf absence will be with us for a long time, and they're much harder to measure. Another Hobbes quote, maintaining an intact ecosystem is so much easier than trying to restore it once the pieces have been lost. So in the words of Aldo Leopold, keep all the parts and things will be much better. So that's my last slide, and we're at about the 45-minute mark. I'd be happy to try and answer questions. And I could stop my screen sharing if that seems right, but I'll take direct.
Yeah, whichever. We could look at this beautiful wolf.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That is, by the way, one of the, it's a long story, but one of the offspring of the immigrant male that came in 1997 and saved the population for about 10 years. So, and he'd killed that moose with his pack mates the previous fall, but it had been floating in that pond and they couldn't feed on it floating in the pond and they couldn't pull it out. So actually we pulled it out the next year in order to get the bones we're after, and then they ate what was left.
Oh my goodness. That is a good story. Well, anyway, everyone, first of all, thank you so much, Rolf. And we will go ahead and take some questions. But before we do, for those of you who joined after the introduction, we are here with Dr. Rolf Peterson, and he just finished his talk on wolf restoration in Isle Royale National Park. And a reminder, if you do have questions, if you could be sure to type them into the Q&A box, and you should find it in your control panel. So if you type it into the chat, we will not see it. So please go to the Q&A box. Okay, so let's see. There are lots of questions, and a lot of them, it looked like, are really focusing on some of those islands you mentioned kind of earlier on in the talk. I'm going to condense some of these questions because people are curious about how far away the islands are, if it was just a pressure of the other wolves that kind of forced the wolves to swim out to these islands during the winter, and also what sort of prey was available on those outer islands.
Oh yeah, the islands are accessible after, at the most a quarter mile, eighth of a mile swim. And in one case, they have to island hop across a couple other islands to get to a bigger island. There are moose on those islands, and the moose that go to those offshore islands often have calves because it's typically a safe place. It hasn't been lately, but moose will seek those outer islands to have their calves. And then there's a few beaver, maybe one colony per island. There have been dead moose and dead beaver found there that the wolves have killed. But it's got to be not primarily a source of food, rather a refuge, I think. And the female particularly spends a lot of time on these islands, and she has some habitual lookout points where she spends a lot of time bedded, and she can scan the whole horizon to make sure nobody's sneaking up on her. So I think it's a place they've found to be safe.
Yeah, it sounds like it. She sounds like a smart cookie. And there are a lot of questions also about the current number of wolves on the island.
Well, we don't know, of course, because we don't know how many pups there are. There were 12 wolves that last winter for sure, including 2 uncollared wolves. And then there could have been as many as 2 other wolves. The native female we never saw evidence of her. I kind of doubt she's around, but she would be a possible 13th. And then the 14th wolf could be alive, and that would be the alpha male, the father of and the mate of 14F from Michipicote. But they split after they were introduced over a month apart. She was already pregnant, and he might be the father, but they didn't spend much time together. And he shed his collar in July of 2019. So he does not wear a radio collar. And there are a bunch of remote cameras that have been set up around the park, but I don't think there's any evidence of him showing up on those. So we don't know what his status is. And then they've got 2, maybe 2.5 litters of pups. So I would expect, I should never predict. No, I won't predict what I think will happen, because I'm very poor at that. And that's one of the important lessons, actually, is we can explain exquisitely what has happened, but we're really not good at predicting what's going to happen right ahead. And because in many cases, really large, unpredicted events happen, like imagine disease, for example.
Of course. Yeah. And there's a lot of questions here about these mystery wolves that you came upon, and what I guess, what are the different scenarios, like where could they have come from? I mean,
the third wolf was a total mystery. He could be actually an immigrant from the mainland. The previous winter, there were clear tracks of 3 wolves that had come across an ice bridge, ironically. And they did a once around Isle Royale, spent several days there, ate 1 moose, and then their tracks disappeared. And we didn't know if they all went back to the mainland, or it could be that somebody hung around. So that's a possibility. And the only other possibility is that it's that male from Michipicoten that got rid of not only his collar but also his ear tags, which just seems very improbable. But every scenario seemed quite improbable. So
yeah, that must have been quite a moment discovering him.
And hopefully genetic studies will illuminate some of these identities. And I was able to get 5 or 10 kind of heavily degraded scats from that bunch, but I would hope we'd learn something from those.
Oh, I hope you do. Where do scats get analyzed that you pick up from Isle Royale?
Oh, by the woman next door to my office, Kristen Bresky, is a new faculty member at Michigan Tech and a canid geneticist. So that's very convenient.
Yes, she's done webinars for us. She's fantastic.
Oh yeah, good.
And her work in the Southeast now with the ghost alleles of these red wolves.
Mhm.
It's fascinating. So it looks like I actually lost track of where this question is because there's so many, there's over 100. We're not going to do them all, don't worry, but there's a lot of questions here. But someone mentioned that they actually did volunteered on the research last summer. And shoot, I wish I could find it again. And they were wondering what are the plans for the research and having volunteers help out now with COVID and everything.
Oh, we canceled all of our Moose Watch expeditions for 2020 this past summer. And at this point, I can only hope that we get a crew to Isle Royale in the winter for winter study. I'm about to post dates for 2021 expeditions for Moose Watch volunteers, but you know, that's just in the hope that things will be possible by then. So yeah, I mean, we don't know what's around the corner, but we're trying to maximize our normal operation as much as we can. But somehow I don't think it's going to happen the way we'd plan it.
Well, it seems like a great place to isolate.
Could have just stayed there,
yeah. Yeah, someone here is asking what the timeline was for the winter study. So maybe not for volunteers, but what about you?
Well, I hope I'll make it there, but I can't guarantee it. I mean, if we go according to plan, we'll start January 19th, but somehow I think there's surprises right around the corner that probably aren't good.
Yeah. Let's cross our fingers and toes.
But the wolves and moose are doing fine, and they probably don't even miss us.
True, but we're so nosy and we like to know what's going on. Are there plans to bring more wolves? And what does that timeline look like, if so?
Oh, there's not any concrete plans to do that. It's under evaluation now, and you know, the immediate concern would be is that the Mitchell wolves have obviously numerically they're in charge of the whole island, and genetically they may be overrepresented, but you know, it's inevitable that somebody's going to be overrepresented when you just throw all these genetic combinations together. And we don't know for sure who the parents are of these pups that we expect are out there right now. So that's an important little detail. Wolves do some sneaky things sometimes when it comes to mating. And so there'll be a real premium on finding fresh scats for genetic analysis to understand, you know, the identities of all the wolves in the population, particularly the parents of the pups.
All right, let's see.
That's up to Kristen. I just hope she's able to do all that.
I know, me too. Let's see. Someone here is asking about the technology you're using, the radio collars, if what kind of radio collars you're using, and both the wolves and the moose.
The Park Service initially wanted to use GPS collars, but you know, one company is different from all the others, and so they tried a mix of both Telonics and Vectronics collars on the wolves, and then for the moose, in order to match a comparable effort on the mainland at the Grand Portage on reservation lands of Grand Portage tribe, we used Vectronic collars, so we would be using identical technology. And so the moose, of course, they can carry a lot of fancy electronics because they're so big, and they have accelerometers and then a thermal sensor on the top of their collar, as well as just GPS signals every 30 minutes. The wolves are on a schedule of every 6 hours.
Yeah, the moose collar looked pretty impressive.
Well, they're substantial, yeah.
Yeah. And this is a timely question. With the removal of Endangered Species Act protection, leaving management to the state departments, does this affect the Isle Royale wolves?
No, Isle Royale wolves aren't really affected at all by delisting. They wouldn't have protection by under the Endangered Species Act, but they're fully protected by the National Park Service, and more so than any other wolves in North America. I mean, all the other national park units that have wolves, the wolves, you know, every wolf probably leaves that park once in its life, and sometimes it only leaves once and it's killed. So
Yeah.
Isle Royale wolves, it may take them a while to realize that they're completely safe, but they really are safe from people.
Yeah. So the surrounding islands are included in the national park?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's about 200 little islands and rocks that surround the big island. So it's all
wow.
part of the national park, which extends 4.5 miles out into the lake.
That sounds beautiful. And speaking of an island, Michipicoten, I had to practice saying that earlier today. Are there any plans to restore wolves to that island?
Oh, I think first thing in order would be to restore caribou, because the caribou in Lake Superior region are essentially gone. I mean, so the Michipicoten caribou, once it was realized that there's wolves there and they're going to eat their way through that population, there was a rescue effort to remove some of the caribou. And I think 10 or 11 caribou were moved over to Slate Islands, which used to have caribou for many, many decades, but wolves got there too and essentially ate all the caribou and then starved to death themselves. So that island was temporarily caribou free and wolf free. So Michipicoten caribou were moved over to Slates where they'd be free of wolf predation. And then there were a half dozen also put on a tiny little island out in the middle of Lake Superior, which is 1,500 acres, called Caribou Island, of all things, which had caribou on it in the 1700s. But as soon as Europeans started showing up, of course, they typically killed everything they could get. And they documented the presence of caribou on Caribou Island. They also shot a bunch. And the caribou have come and gone from that island, but a few moved out there. So there was a rescue effort for the caribou, and then a comparable rescue effort for wolves, which involved moving as many of them as possible off the island to Isle Royale. And then caribou are more in need of a safe refuge in Lake Superior than wolves are. So I think they would be first in order to repopulate Michipicoten.
That makes sense. And when choosing or selecting the wolves to be introduced to Isle Royale, was there any specific criteria taken into account? One of the examples in the question actually says consideration given to the prior pack status of the wolves in their original homes. So even to that degree.
The National Park Service had their own veterinary staff develop some guidelines, and they were circulated around pretty widely for comment. So the wolves had to be healthy, free of diseases, adults, even sex ratio as much as possible, and of a diverse genetic stock. And then beyond that, everything's gravy. So pack affiliation wasn't a luxury that was part of the program very much, although it was clear the Michipicoten wolves were going to come in as a former family group, former pack, and they did. Otherwise, you don't have a lot of control if you're trapping wolves, exactly who you're going to get. A little bit more control if they're being darted from helicopters, which was the other technique used for the Ontario wolves. So But every time there was an opportunity to get genetic diversity, I think it was seized upon.
Makes sense. Someone's asking, actually, when you showed, there's a few questions here about the skulls, the female skull, the male from Mitch Bacotin and the old original dude, I guess. And first question is having about the older original wolf. There was like a big line in the top of the skull, and people are wondering what that is. And then also wondering, after looking at these skulls, do larger wolves, do they have any sort of advantage on the island compared to the smaller wolves?
Oh, I think size does matter. Just because there's strong selective pressure on body size in wolves, depending on the prey that they're feeding on. So the wolves in northern Alberta are the largest in the world because they're feeding on moose for the most part. And so there obviously is strong evolutionary pressure to sort of tie predators' body size with prey body size. And then, so we're watching, I'm very interested in whether these new wolves will fall into the same groove as the original population, or if they're going to do something fundamentally different. And this year, the age structure of the moose killed by wolves, for the most part, these large wolves, is quite different from what we're used to seeing. So most of the moose killed were young adults. And of course, there are there's several possible reasons for that. One is that these were moose born and raised without much reason to fear wolves, and they're just naive. But another reason is these wolves are more efficient at killing moose. So hopefully we can sort that out. And then tracking what changes in the body size of these wolves over time will be of interest too, because the original population of wolves that colonized Isle Royale, there's some evidence that they, within a very short period of a generation or two, got bigger in response to feeding on moose. So I threw this up there. There you see the line across his skull, and that's the brain. His brain case was sawed off in the necropsy lab, so the top of his cranium was detached from his skull, and you never like to see that, but it's a federal and state requirement because of rabies. Historic rabies means any time a wolf goes through an official necropsy lab, it gets the top of its head sawed off and checked for rabies. But there was an unintended benefit, which is that it gave me a close look at the inside of a wolf's brain, a brain case, I should say. And at the front of the brain, near the olfactory bulb, is something called the cribriform plate, where all the nerves from the nose come through into the brain. And there's some 200 holes there for all these nerves. And and sure enough, it's a subject of academic research. So many of these holes have names, and you think, my God, what could possibly be important about all these holes? But it actually is a pretty important indicator of the sense of smell. Animals like wolves that have an exquisite sense of smell have a more developed cribriform plate, and it's even used by paleontologists to guess at how good the sense of smell for extinct animals is. Excuse me. So there's a researcher named Deborah Bird at UCLA that's done a lot of this research. Very beautiful paper.
Yeah, that is.
We'll glue his skull back together, and it'll be fun.
Yeah, he's had better days.
He also had lots of pathology, which you see here. But anyway,
oh my goodness, it's like Frankenstein's lab. And I just have to tell you that you're getting so many just positive comments thanking you. Some friends are saying great job. And I guess I'll end with this question. I know the gist if I can't find it. Someone was just asking, what inspired you to study wolves in the first place?
It was probably a very serendipitous thing, but in 1968, I read Farley Mowat's book, Never Cry Wolf. That was pretty instructive. And then there was a TV program the next year in 1969 called The Wolfmen, a bit of a sexist trope, but anyway, I saw that and realized that the Isle Royale study was still going on. Excuse me. And I thought it had stopped after 10 years. So I applied and fortunately got in as the final student of Durward Allen at Purdue.
That's great. Wolfman.
Yeah, you wouldn't ever produce something like that now.
Oh, that's funny. Well, Rolf, see, I mean, there's 152 questions here, and over 500 people joined us tonight. Actually, we had to have a rollover, and they're watching. It's being live streamed on our YouTube channel because our Zoom account only accommodated 500 people. So apologies to people, but people are just so interested in your work, and they just really think what you're doing is fascinating. So thank you again.
I should emphasize this isn't my work. I mean, I'm reporting
your
on
team.
The work of a huge mob of people, and so it's and lots of volunteers too. So yeah, dozens of people, and I mean it's a gigantic effort, and it all turned out very nicely so far.
Yeah. No, it really is great. And everyone, they're all telling us so on this in the Q&A box that I directed them to. So, so is there anything else you want to cover just before we wrap up?
Wear your mask.
I love it. Yes, definitely wear a mask. So then you can get back going. The volunteers can do the winter studies and everything else. And we can find out what's going on with the soap opera unfolding on Isle Royale. So Rolf, thanks again. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. And if you would like to learn more about the Isle Royale Wolf and Moose Project, what is the website for that?
Wolf.org takes you to the International Wolf Center. So we just put Isle Royale in front of that. So IsleRoyaleWolf.org.
Okay, so IsleRoyaleWolf.org, and on Facebook, I think it's the Wolf and Moose.
Wolf and Moose of Isle Royale. Yeah.
Of Isle Royale, there you go, and yeah, some really interesting stuff. And if you want to learn more about the Wolf Conservation Center, or our scientific webinar series, or the 41 wolves who call the center home, just visit our website, and that is just www.nywolf.org. So everyone, thank you for joining us tonight, and wear your mask, and Rolf especially, thank you. And we hope to see you soon.
Yep. Thank you, Maggie.
All right. Good night, everybody.